Hi everyone, I'm Gina Philibert Ortega for Genealogy Bank. I've got a research question for you. When you're searching the Genealogy Bank historical newspaper collection and you want to find your ancestor's obituary, what search terms do you use? You might say, well, obviously I search by name, but do you also add the keyword obituary to find obituaries? Should you? Is that something you should be doing? Well, let's take a look at the website and let's talk a little bit about how to do better obituary searches and whether that search should include the word obituary or not. Let's go over to the website and take a look. I started off asking you a question. How do you search for obituaries in the historical newspaper collection of Genealogy Bank? And you might have thought, well, that's easy. I search by name. And that's great. That's what you should do. And you can do that in the simple search for Genealogy Bank, or you can open up the advanced search. Now, if you open up the advanced search, one of your options is keywords to include or exclude. I would caution you about using the word obituary in that keyword. Why? Well, every newspaper is different. Some newspapers, depending on time and place, call them obituaries or obituary, but not all do. And so if you enter your ancestor's name and the word obituary or obituaries, you might be accidentally narrowing down that search more than you meant to be. So let's look at some examples about what titles obituary columns have. So for example, let's look at this one from 1814 in New York. And you can see in this fancy script it says obituary, though the OCR for the newspaper may have a hard time reading that. And then it just says died. So looking up obituary may or may not find these obituaries. Now let's look at another example. Once again, it says simply died. So there's two examples now, they're both in the 19th century that show it just says died. But like I said, there are obituaries that say obituary or obituaries. So the problem is you may not know what your ancestors' newspaper called those obituaries. So that's why you don't want to narrow your search by that all at once. Now, let's look at another example. When we do a search, we can start with a name, and that, depending on the name, might give us a lot of results, and a lot of results that have nothing to do with our ancestor. But we can then start to narrow down that search. So I'm going to look for my Lars Peterson, but he lived his whole life, well, most of his life, in Arizona. So we'll narrow it down to that. Now, if I know when someone died, I could further narrow this search. I could do a date range or a year range. And so that's one way that I can narrow it down to exactly the kind of article that I want, knowing that the person died in a specific year, for example. Now, I could also, because I've narrowed it down by state, I could go ahead and narrow this search down even further to where he lived, and that might help me as well. So those are two things to keep in mind as I'm searching. Now, remember how I said that those obituary columns sometimes aren't called obituary? Here's another example. So this is a small town newspaper that served several towns in the White Mountains of Arizona. And you can see, if I scroll all the way up, it says news items from correspondence, and it's for the various cities that it covers. Now, let me scroll down, and you can see here there is basically a notice for a baby of Mr. and Mrs. Lars Peterson who had died. Now, you may say, well, that's not really an obituary, but for a baby, this is probably as close to an obituary as we're going to get. And as you can see, nowhere on the page does it say obituaries. So that's why we need to stay away from including keywords that may not exist. Now, I'll tell you, often if I'm trying to narrow it down to an obituary, I might use words like died or funeral or survivors, because I'm pretty sure those words are going to appear in that article. So if I'm searching for a name like John Smith, I may add those as keywords to include to see if I can find the obituary that way. So as you search, keep in mind to narrow your search by a time period, whether that's a few months or a year period, a year range, by a certain state, maybe even a city. You can even narrow down to a title if you know the exact title of the newspaper. But try to stay away from narrowing your search by the word obituary unless you know that the column is called obituary. So should you use the word obituary or obituaries as you're searching for an obituary in the historical newspaper collections on Genealogy Bank? Well, maybe or maybe not. Not all obituary articles, columns in the newspaper are titled with the word obituary, and so we need to be mindful of that. You could be adding the keyword obituary and accidentally losing results that could really help you because they just simply don't match. Now, if you've taken the time to browse your ancestors' local newspaper to see what they are calling the obituary column, then you could use that as a keyword. But otherwise, consider focusing your search first on your ancestor's name, but then do a date range and then maybe a state search, and see if you focus and narrow your search that way if you find what you need. I hope that gave you something to think about and to think about your searching differently. Good luck with your searches, and I'll see you next time.